I went traveling for a while. I spent like a bunch of time in Ireland and a couple other places in Europe, and just like seeing how people identified very strongly with where they were from, and not just their country, but their specific area where they're from. And it started to make me think about my identity as an American, um, and you know, uh, how I associate with certain places in my country, places I've never been before in my country, and it made me start to think more like my country is California. And I started to think specifically about the place where I grew up, and the place where I grew up I always felt like seemed to not really have um, an actual identity. Everything was kind of like, you go to the supermarket, you go to this shopping center, it's fast food places, it's subdivisions. It's kind of like, what's the thing that connects you deeper to that place? And so I started to think about my own area, where I'm from, where I grew up, the place that's most familiar to me as a person. And I actually learned about a Stanislaw, who was his Yokut's name was Kukunuchi. He was from this area, by the Stanislaus River, which runs right to the north of Modesto, where I grew up. And I didn't learn about him until I moved to San Francisco, took a California history class, and I learned that he had led the largest indigenous uprising against colonial rule in California's history. And it happened right here in my own backyard. But even though my county is named after him, Stanislaus County is named after him, I had always heard the name, but I never knew who he was or what he did, or until I moved away, learned about it, and realized that this really significant part of California history happened right in my own backyard. And so that kind of got me thinking about, all of the places where I've been by, a million times, whether here in the Central Valley or in the Bay Area or Southern California or wherever else that I'm traveling, been by these places a bunch of times. You hear, street names or names of towns or, mountains or rivers or whatever, all these names. And it's just like, I don't really know who any of these people are. And I think based on conversations I've had with people, a lot of people don't know who any of these people are, which means you don't know the stories of the place where you're from. And if you don't know the stories of the place where you're from, then how can you be really from that place? If we're just sort of going about our daily business on a very sort of shallow, superficial level without any understanding of what actually happened here. So that kind of started the whole thing about wanting to learn about different people in California's history in order to as a broader way to understand the stories of the places where we live. There hasn't really been like a really strict procedure as to how I choose. Basically, I just learn about somebody and they sound like an interesting person, or maybe the context in which they found themselves was interesting, learning about the historic context, and just being sort of inspired to do a picture about them. Most of the people that I do are or that I've done so far anyway, they're semi well known, or they're not really well known. Like a Stanislaw was not very well known, even having grown up here. Like 90% of the people I would if I asked 90% of the people around here who a Stanislaw was and what he did, nobody would be able to say. But there's other people like Joaquin Murrieta is a far better known person, and most people I think would know at least that he was an outlaw, but not necessarily his full story. There are people that I just found out just through just came across just online, or through I don't know, just through reading about California history. Just their name would come up and I'd be like, I wonder who that person is and what their story was. So and finding out about the context. So like a broader information about California, but finding out about that through a particular person. So like one example is William Shorey, who I did a picture of. He was the only African-American whaling captain on the West Coast. And he was really well known too for being like a really good captain. They had a really good culture on the ship. Like, it was very safe. He was able to bring back his sailors, in an occupation that was very dangerous, and a lot of sailors died in the whaling industry. He was known for being a really good captain and being able to navigate through difficult situations and bring everyone home safe. And so reading more about him, I found out about the whaling industry on the West Coast, which used to be concentrated on the East Coast. But then as the whale population in the Atlantic started to dwindle, and the voyages had to be longer, they had to go around to the Pacific, and they'd be gone for 6 months or even a year at times. Eventually the industry moved from New England, where it was concentrated, and moved west so that they could tap into the whale populations in the Pacific. And so it moved to the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area. And so that's William Shorey came out to California during that time when the whole industry was moving west. And so then he settled in Oakland, and then became a prominent member of the African-American business community in Oakland, and was a pretty influential figure there. So just learning about that whole history of the whaling industry, and that shift to the West Coast and why that was happening is interesting, like hearing or learning about that through studying a person, like looking more into a person's story, and then finding out more about the story of our state as a whole. So Stanislaw was a leader from this area, from the Central Valley, Modesto area. And his original birth name was Kukunuchi, which is of the Yokuts language, who are the people from the San Joaquin Valley. He was born and raised in the Central Valley near the Stanislaus River. And when he was an adult, they were approached by the missionaries coming from the coast that were coming out here, telling people about this sort of different way of life on the coast, and at the missions, and about this religion and these different things that they were teaching. So they were trying to coax people into coming back with them to the missions, so that they can learn these different things. And so he was kind of among these people that had, from my understanding, had sort of like from his own will, just out of his own kind of curiosity, wanting to know like what was happening, went with them with his wife and his child. When they got to the missions, his wife and his child came down with an illness. I'm not sure exactly which illness, but they had both died. And he remained at the mission. He actually became a pretty high-ranking person at the mission, basically the highest level that someone could be as a Native person in the mission. But it became apparent to him very quickly that this was no longer a sort of a choice, situation, is that people were being kept there as prisoners. They were being kept there as slaves. And so he and a number of other people decided to escape. They left Mission San Jose, where they were living, and had gone back to the Central Valley, back to the Stanislaus River. And they started to drum up this sort of resistance to the missions on the coast. And so part of that resistance was they would go and conduct these raids among different colonial, ranches on the coast, stealing horses, bringing them back to the Central Valley. And so it became such a nuisance among the government, the colonial government, that they sent soldiers from the Presidio inland to retrieve the horses, and also to punish Stanislaw and the other people who had, were carrying out these raids. And so the first, actually, and Stanislaw and all of his, the people he was, fighting with, they knew they were going to be pursued, so they built an actual fort along the Stanislaus River, with, like, from my understanding of it, it sounds like a trench system, and like barricades from fallen trees, and just like and grown into the sort of like riparian landscape there, the dense forest. And from that fort, they were able to repel 2 attacks from the colonial forces. They sent one contingent out. They were repelled and had to come back to the Presidio and say we weren't able to uproot them. So they sent a larger group out. Then they were repelled also and had to come back. And then finally, the third time, they were led by General Vallejo, and they brought a cannon with them and a number of other, a larger force. They set fire to the forest along the river there, and were finally able to uproot, Stanislaw and his people there, like in their fort. So they kind of remained at large. So Vallejo goes back to the Presidio, and they say we've scattered their movement. They've been scattered. We're victorious. But Stanislaw and his people were still, they were still at large. They were still, conducting raids. They were still doing their thing. But eventually, and I don't know exactly why this is the case, but he did, a number of years later, he did go back to the missions. He did go back to the colonies, and he was pardoned by the governor. A lot of places in California you go, and they're not really properly cities. It's not really a city. There's no downtown, or maybe there is a downtown, but it's kind of dilapidated and dispersed. And most of the social life happens in these sort of like shopping centers and subdivisions. That's kind of where most people live and reside. And those places, the history is not prominent there. It's like this development was not here 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And honestly, it's probably not going to be there 50 years from now. It's just here in the present, and it's not going to last, and it was never here before. So it's like there's no sense of like having a deeply connected, this is a building where my grandparents used to, or my great grandparents used to go and like, dance or whatever, and now it's a grocery store, and that's where I go and shop for my food. It's like, no, there was nothing there before. It then became a big box. That's where you shop. And in 50 years, the box is probably going to be gone, and it'll be something else. And so there's a lot of that sort of like, there's just no sense of like a deeper connection to a place. And I think that in not knowing what happened in a certain area, you can look at a place and be like, it's just a field. Like nothing happened there. It's just, it's just a field. Like, I don't know what happened there. I have no idea. And if people don't know the history of that field and what happened there, then there's a devaluing of that field. And you'll allow anybody to do anything with that field. If somebody said, well, I'm going to build a Bed Bath and Beyond on it and a Buffalo Wild Wings. And it's like, oh, cool. I love Buffalo Wild Wings. That'd be great. But if you had no idea what happened on that field, you might be selling out the history of your place and a part of your identity as a person who's from that place for, chicken wings. And, like that's what you're getting in return, The Lion Bridge, it's called the 7th Street Bridge, and it's some people call it the Lion Bridge, but it was built in 1917. It's just here in downtown Modesto, actually just south of downtown, and it goes over the Tuolumne River. And basically, it's an old bridge, and it's just been completely neglected for decades and decades. There's an article from the 1970s that I found, and it was talking about like, city council like is trying to figure out what to do about the dilapidated bridge, and it like is still even more dilapidated. Like the what is it, like American Engineering Association or something like that rated it as like an F. Like in terms of bridges, it's like that sketchy. So it's like it's almost like beyond repair. But when I first moved back here to Modesto, my grandma, when she lived here back in the 40s, she would work in a lot of like ag jobs, a lot of like, working in the fields, and she also worked in canneries and stuff. And there was a time when they were staying in Modesto, right near that bridge. And she used to walk across that bridge to work the night shift at the cannery on the other side of the river. And when my parents moved up here and she came up to visit, she wanted to go and see the bridge. So there's that kind of like intergenerational connection to a piece of infrastructure or building. And like now the county and the city are talking about destroying it and then replacing it with a really like kind of bland looking bridge when you see what they want to build there. And it's just really sad that and I think that like when there's old buildings that have been there for a long time, your ancestors had gone in and interacted with that structure, and you're interacting with the same structure. And I think like collectively, over time, as more buildings are just kind of destroyed like that and discarded, new ones are built and then they're destroyed after a few decades or whatever, I think it kind of lends itself to this notion of like a perpetual childhood of our country, where we're always like, we're a young country. It's like, we're not really a young country. Oscar Wilde actually has a great quote that's, it's something like America's youth is its oldest tradition. It's been going on now for over 300 years. It's like we constantly are just kind of like, we're a young country, we just don't have as much history as, Europe and stuff. But it's like, I think it kind of continues to perpetuate, that notion continues to perpetuate itself as we continue to demolish old buildings and old, structures. And when we build some new shiny object, and then, whatever's built in its place, like in 50 years, it's probably not going to be there. So it's kind of just thinking about how we kind of connect to previous generations and to future generations just through the buildings that we all inhabit. And, as we walk past them on our errands or, whatever, there's this kind of like connection to past and future generations. And if every generation just destroys what was ever there before and then builds the new thing, and then the next generation destroys it, it kind of like, I think, sort of severs that connection, at least in like a physical sense. Joaquin Murrieta came to California from Mexico during the gold rush, and it was right after Mexico had lost the Mexican-American War against the United States, and California had newly become a state. And so there was a lot of discrimination that happened against Mexicans that were living in California. And so he had some really horrible, traumatic encounters with some of the Anglo-American miners. And his wife and his brother were both brutally murdered by some vigilante, some white vigilante groups. And so that's what turned him to sort of his, life of crime and sort of like rebellion against this dominant force in California. And so he started to go around and steal, various things, money or property of various sorts, and actually had a group of people that were, would follow him. He had sort of like gang of people that would go around and do this. And he's been a big, from my understanding, a big sort of folk hero among Mexican Americans of this resistance against this sort of like white imposing, this imposing culture in the West, and especially in places like California and Arizona, New Mexico, Texas. And so to me, as a white Californian, I didn't really know anything about Joaquin Murrieta. I had heard his name before mentioned, but didn't really know much about him. And so I started to kind of like, research more about him for this piece, and knew that he was a significant person in California history, but didn't really know a whole lot about him. So I started to do more research about him, and that's when I learned about the broader context of his significance in California. I wanted to have a very kind of like, action sort of like picture of him. So I have the horse jumping, like in sort of into the panels, Usually when I'm doing the panels, I don't have it planned out. I start drawing the person, and I even start drawing the stuff in the foreground, and I even get pretty far along with the whole picture before I even decide what's going to go in the panels. Like the panels will be blank for the majority of the time I'm working on it, and then I'll finally decide like, okay, that's what I'm going to do in the panels. And with him, I kind of do both the Mexican flag and the California flag as those kind of like two parts of his. So we have on the one side is the eagle and the snake on the cactus from the Mexican flag, and then on the right side you have the grizzly bear from the California flag. So it's kind of like the, Mexico and California, so yeah, I wanted to have those kind of two aspects of it. And then also on the sides, I have the panels. So on the left side is you have the sort of like mining equipment. So you have like the pickaxes, the shovels, and the gold panning and stuff like that. That's his life, that he was pursuing this peaceful life of being able to carve out his homestead for himself. And but it was disrupted, of course. And then on the right side you have the guns and the ammunition and the those sort of aspects of his identity that was what he became famous for. The stuff in the foreground is, I have the different kind of symbolic things down there. The money just kind of alludes to the fact that he was stealing wealth from one group and dispersing it to another group in this sort of like act of economic justice, for people who had had their wealth stolen, either that being in land or in livestock or in actual money or whatever it is, having their wealth stolen from this group of invaders and occupiers who had just recently taken over. And then the other side, on the left side, I have the jar, and it's an empty jar, and next to it there's the big jug of alcohol, and it alludes to the nature of his death. He was killed by there was a group hired by the governor of California at the time to go out and take care of this situation with this band of outlaws, and they had been ambushed down near Coalinga, which is kind of in the valley, like I think it's down kind of near Fresno, but around there is where they were ambushed. And the story goes that Joaquin Murrieta's head, they cut off his head, they put it in a jar and filled it with alcohol to preserve it, and then they went to the Capitol, collected their bounty, because they were paid a bounty for having killed Joaquin Murrieta, and then they took his head all over California, and they charged people $1 to see his head. And so when I was thinking about, I wanted to like allude to the nature of his death and the brutality of it, because it speaks to the brutality that was inflicted upon Mexican Americans in California at the time. There's actually very well documented evidence of brutality that in lynchings that had occurred in the Western United States after the Mexican American War. And I was thinking, well, maybe I could have his head in the jar or whatever, but then I thought that would have been sort of I didn't want the nature of his death to distract from the actual person who he was and what he did. So I allude to the nature in which he was killed by having the empty jar, but keeping it empty and not having his head there, because I feel like the attention of people would go to that sort of shock value of a person's head in a jar. So I wanted to keep the jar empty, in that he's still alive there and he's jumping through the panels. The backgrounds, the sort of like suburbs and the parking lots and the shopping centers and everything, they're places that, like, I think I had mentioned before that I had read that according to HUD, like 53% of Americans consider the place where they live to be suburban. And so places like this that are in the backgrounds of a lot of these pictures are places that are very familiar. There's the main historic figure, their story and the historic context, in which they existed. And you can look at that and be like, oh, interesting, this person, this time and place. But you can be connected to that person through the familiar environment that's behind that person in the same art piece. So it brings you into the art piece, into the illustration, to be more like directly connected to that person. Even though when you're existing in that shopping center in the parking lot or whatever, you don't think like this was the land that, you know, Joaquin Murrieta might have passed right through this, you know, neighborhood where I'm living right now, because it bears no resemblance whatsoever to the time that he was there. But you're still walking on the same land. It's still part of the, you know, it's still part of the landscape. You're still connected through the landscape, even though the landscape doesn't look anything like it did before. The styrofoam borders, as just like my coworker from like years ago had mentioned that she was coming home from a party late at night, trying, like when she was in high school, trying to sneak through her bedroom window, and she lived in one of those newer housing developments. And when she was climbing up the molding on her window to try to get in, it just completely broke off, and it was nothing. It was just stucco on the outside and styrofoam underneath. So all the decorative molding on the outside of the home was just styrofoam with stucco over it. And apparently that's the case with a lot of these newer buildings, big box stores and stuff like that, where you see the molding, it's actually just nothing but styrofoam underneath. And there's a building in downtown Modesto here. I was walking by it, and it looked like somebody had taken a sledgehammer to it. And you can see on the actual molding itself, you could go up and see the styrofoam poking through, and it's like, you know, it's just got this stucco outside, and then underneath it's just nothing but styrofoam. So I kind of wanted to like feature that in all the borders in my drawings. It's a lot of just like finding whatever I can find like online. I might find some stuff at the library. Like for a Stanislaw, I had gotten a couple of books and was reading about him. There's sort of like for some of the people, like a Stanislaw, for example, there's not like a whole lot online I was able to find. So that's why I was like compelled to like find it through other sources like the library, or find books about him and stuff like that. For Sally Ride, because she's a lot more recent, I'm able to find like quite a bit of stuff about her just online, just through things that people wrote about her, at least enough to do like, you know, a good sort of like representation of her and have these different panels and stuff like that. So yeah, it's kind of just, I always want to kind of find out more, like there's the person and like their main thing that they're known for, but if I can have additional things that are like additional things about the person that aren't necessarily related to, you know, what they did. So like Sally Ride, for example, I have, she was a tennis player, and actually a really good tennis player, and like could have like gone pro. And so I have, that's not central to the fact that, you know, she was like, you know, the first American female astronaut. But I allude to that, you know, in one of, you know, the little kind of side things, you know, I have a tennis racket, you know, and she was a big stamp collector too. So I think I'm going to like incorporate somehow into the picture, like, you know, some stuff about stamps, like just like those, like kind of like fun, like sort of facts about her on the side. And then central to the picture though is going to be her, like, you know, significance as the first American female astronaut. And so I try to do that for the other ones too. But as you go further and further back, it's harder to know a whole lot about the, you know, a lot of that information about, you know, the personal lives of people. Like Lily Coit, for example, she was, I was able to find out some kind of interesting stuff about her, just like as a person, that she used to be really into smoking cigars and like drinking whiskey and playing poker. And like she used to like frequent like the gambling halls and stuff in San Francisco. But she was this kind of like very like prominent sort of like socialite in San Francisco. And like had a lot of wealth and stuff, but she had this sort of like aspect of her personality where like she wanted to like be in that element, smoking cigars and like hanging out, playing poker. So I like incorporated that into the drawing. But a lot of times with the historic people, it's kind of like, if the older and older they are and the less information there is about them, the harder it is to kind of like know the other aspects of their personality. Some of the historic people, they like, I couldn't find an actual like legitimate like portrait of them or a photo or anything. So a Stanislaw was like probably the best example of that. I couldn't find one like artistic rendering of him besides the statue. There's a statue in downtown Modesto and it's an interpretation of him, but from what I've read about him, the statue doesn't quite line up with like what the description of him is. So I kind of had to like piece together like part of it was actually reading about like the traditional like clothing of the Yokuts from 200 years ago, like what they would have worn, if they had, jewelry, if, like what they like traditionally would have worn 200 years ago. And then kind of like taking that and then reading about kind of what the clothing was like in the Mexican missions, like in the colonies, kind of what they wore, and then kind of thinking maybe like combining sort of a version of the two of those and combining it with the actual description I was able to find of a Stanislaw, and kind of like bring the three of those together into a representation of what I think maybe he might have looked like and what he might have dressed like. So because I couldn't find a picture of him anywhere or any like artist renderings really of him. So with him it was very sort of like inventive like that. With Sally Ride, the pose that I'm doing, I didn't find an actual photo of her in that pose. I wanted to do her floating, like zero gravity, So I was looking up different pictures of her. Most of them's like pictures of her, like on the space shuttle, and it's either just pictures of like her face. There's a couple of them where she's kind of like floating, but not really at the angle I want her to be, like in the picture. So my girlfriend and I both took pictures of each other, like sitting on the couch, like on the arm of the couch, trying to like look like we're floating so that I could like, cause I was trying to look up like poses online. I was trying to put like people in zero gravity. I'd like type that into Google and then see if I could find a person that was like floating in the angle that I wanted them to be floating, but I couldn't find anything. So I just kind of like was like, okay, well, just like, here, take a couple of pictures of me just like sitting on the arm of the couch, like with my legs suspended. Yeah, like I always kind of do it off the same sort of template. Like there's sort of like the format that they all go, with the arches, the panels, and kind of generally what goes in the panels and in the foreground. In terms of like the sort of like artistic elements of the actual like painting and drawing and stuff like that. First I do a pencil drawing, and usually like just to try to get the person like formed properly, like their, the posturing and the pose and everything, and to make sure that they're completely within frame. Sometimes I'll start drawing somebody and I'll think like, yeah, this is looking pretty good. But then I realize as I get down to their foot that their foot is going to go off the page. And then I'm just like, so I have to like erase the whole thing and then like redraw it. So it's like, so yeah, because I can't, it's all like, drawn like physically. So I can't, like on an online program or something, you could like, shrink it or, move it up or down or whatever. But when drawing it, I just like, okay, well, so I try not to get too much detail done before I get the person like really like, okay, I know everything's going to be within frame. And then making sure also that they're not taking up too much of a panel. So I don't want somebody's head to be going right into the middle of the panel, because then it won't give me any room to draw anything in the panel. So it's kind of like doing that too. I try to like create a sort of like dimensions by So I do the pencil drawing of the person once I get them like right where I need to get them, like right where everything fits. And then I draw all this sort of like symbolic stuff, you know, down in the foreground. I get a layout of, you know, what the sort of suburban or you know, urban background is going to look like. I use like a compass to get to get like the arches right and everything. So there's like a little measurements that go into that. And then once I have all of that, I start to pen it in. And the further back I go, I use a smaller point pen further back. And then as I get closer and closer, like the pen is a bigger sort of like Sharpie ballpoint, or not ballpoint, but you know, the fine tip Sharpie sort of for the foreground. And then once I get all of the penning done, then I erase the pencil underneath, so it just shows just the line drawing. And then I take watercolor to it, and I do like watercolor washes in the back. So usually the very back, I'll do a gray wash over everything. With a lot of them, there's kind of a red sky. I do a red sky on most of them just because I like the way it looks. But I do various different ones. But then the sort of suburban background, I do gray. It's pretty much gray all the way. And then each like little shopping center and house and stuff, I go over it with colored pencil. And I've found that the watercolor wash in the back like dulls the vibrancy of the colored pencil. So like with yellow, for example, if I did it directly on a white piece of paper, it would pop a lot more. But because I do a gray wash in the back and then I go over it with the yellow colored pencil, it dulls the yellow. So the yellow doesn't distract from the main person in the foreground. So it kind of helps give the sort of you know, like the distance between the person in the foreground and everything that's going on back. Because the person in the foreground, I usually leave them white, so they're just like the white paper underneath, and then I do the colored pencil around them. And then when I go directly to do the person in the foreground, it's just straight colored pencil, so the colors are a lot more vibrant. And then I have to go over again. Once I do the colored pencil parts, then I go over with pen again to, you know, because the pen will start to get dulled once I've gone over it with colored pencil. The lines become a lot more sort of like blurred. So I go over it again with pen, just to like reestablish the black lines around everything. What I would like people to get out of the series is like on the like mainly it's you know, there's the educational aspect of it about that particular person. You know, it's like you know, for people to find out something more about the place where they're from based on a drawing that I've done. You know, like, oh, I didn't know about that person. Kind of beyond that, I didn't know about that person, but I also didn't know about all those different aspects of that time and place. And then also just to like spur people's curiosity about where they're from. So even if I don't do a piece of a person who's from a particular area or focus on a historic period in a certain area, that somebody will at least be like, oh, interesting, I wonder what happened in my area, you know, and they might like do some research and be inspired to find out about the stories that happen, you know, where they're from. And then I think kind of broader is just give us a better understanding of the place where we live. Like I said, it's not like Europe is any older or has any more history than California is. But it's to kind of get beyond the notion that like history started when the first white people showed up in California. I want people to kind of like think more about that too. So, and also kind of by extension, valuing the land that we live on and that we walk on every day. So that like what I was saying earlier about seeing a field and just being like, I don't know what happened in that field. Like probably nothing. So yeah, like build a shopping mall there, you know, like put a Starbucks in there or whatever it is, because I, you know, Yeah, I would love to have mocha, a drive through where I could get a mocha frappuccino or whatever it is. But it's like if you don't know what happened on the field where that Starbucks is about to go, you might be losing a piece of your history, or at least loot like it's another separation. It's another degree of separation between you and being able to connect with what happened in that place. I hope that people like first, like are like find out something new about a person and a place and a time in history. That's kind of the main part. Second part is spurring people's curiosity about where they're from and about what the stories are of the place where they're from. And then third is the more kind of like general fundamental aspect of it, which is through finding out about the history and about the stories of your area, valuing more like the land around us and the places where we are.